My name is Megan. I'm the Executive Director at the Bayfield Heritage Association. I invite you to visit our website if you want to check out other past program recordings and to look at some of our online educational content that we've been producing over the last several months. Bob Dahl was born into an established Sand Island family. His great-grandparents emigrated from Norway in the 1890s and settled on Sand Island. His grandparents, all four of them, either immigrated from Norway or were of Norwegian descent and made a livelihood of fishing and farming on the island in the early 1900s. His parents were raised and married on Sand Island. Bob, born in December of 1942, less than a month old, he crossed over thin ice in January of 1943 to Sand Island, which would be his home for the first 2 years of his life. He was educated in Bayfield, went to college in Superior studying sociology, and then went on to get his master's in counseling psychology. As we will see tonight, he is a lifelong learner. He later earned an MBA from the University of North Florida. Bob visits the Apostle Islands several times a year and still finds fishing off Sand Island with his brother and sister, where his great-grandfather, grandfather, and father once fished, to be a highlight. Bob's stories in The Islander come from the heart of a true Islander. And without further ado, I turn it over to you, Bob.
Thank you very much, Megan. The Islander coming of age in the Apostle Islands has been a labor of love for probably 50 years. I have been writing stories for a long time. I have written probably about 30 stories. In this book, there are 10 of those stories. There are 5 maps of the area. The foreword was written by Peter Yench, whom some of you may know, some of you may not know, but he was quite sick when he wrote the foreword. He's was a close personal friend of mine. He died within about 2 months of writing the foreword. So to me, the foreword is kind of special. There are 19 recipes from the area. Bobby Nelson had several from Rocky Island. We had them from Bayfield and Washburn and Sand Island and all over. And a lot of people have tried some of those recipes and they've been apparently pretty successful. There are over 100 photos in the book, many historic from Lewick, the lighthouse keeper, from the old days, Fred Hansen, who was a photographer, Bert Hill, who was a photographer back in the early to mid 1900s, and others, as well as many period photos, many from our family archives, many from Mary Rice's archives, and other archives. I'm not going to repeat the stories that are in the book, but rather explain why I wrote some of these stories and what some of my techniques were to write some of these stories. One of them is quite long, and it would take time just to go through that one story of the Savona. This is Sand Island. Many of you know Sand Island, at least where it is. Back in the day when I lived there, you can see in East Bay quite a few names. There were a lot of people who were there during my time and before my time. I have not listed anybody in here who was there after my time. If you look almost right in the middle of the bay where the Noring farm is, you come right up from there, you'll see C.O. Dahl. That's my father's place. I want to thank a couple of people, Jeff Peters, Barbara Peters, Jeff's daughter Jill, the Apostle Islands Conservancy, and the Park Service, because they've made a lot of these photos available to me and helped considerably in making this project possible. The first story in the book, what I did was take the story of the wreck of the Savona, really define Sand Island in that it kind of put a bracket on it from 1905 on. It became probably better known than it was before that time because of the wreck of the Savona. In this presentation, I'm presenting some photos that aren't in the book. They're related to, but aren't in. This would be one of those photos. That happens to be a photo of the Pete Hansen property, and that's Pete and his wife. That is in the story. And some of the men who crashed on Sand Island who lived, that's the house that they went to and knocked on the door. What I tried to do was humanize the story from the point of the people from Sand Island, who were all relatives of mine, the story of the sinking of the Savona. I took it from the point of view of the islanders. The writings that you see on here are actually from the book. Some of them I will read to you because they demonstrate humanizing the island people as well as some of the people that were on the Savona. The first day in September 1905 had been seasonably cool. So Fred wore a tattered fisherman's sweater passed down from his father and still smelling a little of fish and tobacco. This favorite pullover hung loose on his young frame, but he did not mind as he watched his dad striding between two small adjacent docks, each with a fish house, one owned by Herman Johnson and one by Pete Hansen, Fred's father. That picture that you see there shows the Sand Island light in silhouette. This is probably a little closer than where the Savona sank to the lighthouse, but it would be roughly in that direction from the wreck. They didn't see the lighthouse or they would have avoided the shoal. Houses look the same for over 100 years, so that has not changed. Okay, the moon was rising south over the peninsula. Below the bank, a whisper of a zephyr rippled the water far out in the bay. The north wind was picking up and starting to hold steady. What I did was go back and forth from those who were on the island and those who were on the Savona. When I'm talking about Fred Hansen standing, he's standing, you can see way to the left is a dock. That's the Pete Hansen dock. The dock in the foreground is the Herman Johnson Senior dock. Those of you who have spent time in Little Sand Bay knew Herman Johnson Jr. This was his father's place. This picture was taken after the sinking of the Savona because the White House and the dark barn, those are Fred Hansen's places that he built after 1906. The guest and day crew slept while the Savona passed the Sand Island lock at starboard beam, the beacon nearly invisible in the mounting threat. The wind had increased significantly over the last 6 hours and approached gale force by midnight. Full-fledged nor'easter was howling greater than 200 miles of Lake Superior between Canada and the Apostles, with no bumps of land to stop it. The storm approached faster than expected, more dangerous than feared. This is a picture of the Savona before it was lengthened. There was some speculation that it may have broken where the joint had been made, but it actually broke somewhere else. But that is the Savona. And this is the Savona after it was lengthened. You can see it's quite a bit longer. I think it was one of the biggest ore carriers on the lake at the time. Fred Hansen wakes up at midnight, goes down to look at the water, which is pretty much what we do when you live on an island. You're always checking the weather. Roughly 15 minutes later, still sailing blind, the Savona ran hard aground on what turned out to be the Sand Island Shoal, under the surface and approximately a mile east of Sand Island's North Point. Here is some pictures that you don't see very often, is the Savona after the wreck. These are very small, almost thumbnail-sized pictures, so they're not very clear, but they do show the Savona, and to the far right, the Pete Hansen house. The men who landed in Justice Bay were wet. Their boat got wrecked when they landed. They found a path, and they followed that path, and they ended up at Pete Hansen's house. The writing that is there is from the book, is how I would imagine largely uneducated seamen would have spoken when they approached the Hansens. On that fateful day, 7 men drowned off Sand Island. On the same day, 5 drowned off Outer Island from the schooner barge Pretoria, the largest wooden boat ever built up to that time. The Grim Reaper harvested 12 victims from the Apostle Islands that fateful September in 1905. I found it interesting that of course, there are 12 apostles. There are more than that in the Apostle Islands, but that 12 souls taken in that one storm, which I just found interesting. The hatch covers, which you can see in this photo quite clearly, is the white with vertical stripes. Those are the hatch covers from the Savona, and they made this cottage. And the cottage is particularly interesting to me because I lived in it for 7 years. My bed was right behind that one on the second floor. When I worked for the Andersons, I lived in the Savona, which was a treat. Sometimes on windy nights, you could hear the moans and groans of the sailors. The second story in there is riffraff. This picture is not in the book either. This is of my sister Connie and my sister Sharon, Connie holding the pole. And we made multiple rafts over the years living on Sand Island. You will know the cover of the book that there is a big raft. That was an unusually big raft. And on that raft is, from the right is my brother Carl. I'm kneeling down in the middle. And Paul Hansen, our first cousin, Jake Hansen's son, is sitting on the box on the left. The sun beat as gentle waves gurgled between the raft logs and coaxed our little minds toward adventures first experienced through the wintertime movie matinees at the Harbor Theater in Bayfield, or better, still radio Friday and nights in our island living room. Each dorm bared or deposited new valuables, so out we rafted on yet another foray. Most of our riches ended up in a dock crib, resting there out of sight. They usually served no other purpose, gems though they were to us. The finest of the smooth glass found a home in Mom's beach glass jar. This photograph is obviously taken at the same time as the cover photograph, in that it was at the end of the roll. And I just found it interesting that Paul is there and I'm talking to him about something and Carl is posing as the engine. And this is the glass jar that my mother kept her valuable glass in, and it now is in the possession of Eric Dahl, who is Carl's son. And you can see in the story I mentioned some of the value of the reds, the blues. The whites and the greens were fairly common, but the blues were really special. The third chapter in the book has to do with John B. Chappell. John was a true friend of Islanders. He came out to Sand Island a lot. The Wisconsin Islands is a newspaper supplement that John did back in 1945, I believe it was. That drawing down there of the dock and the boat was done by Francine Hansen, Jake's wife. That's the Dorothea is the boat, and what we always call Jake's dock, but was Hansen's dock. Westhagen's took over in later years. This is from the Mary Rice collection. It's my mother and dad, and that's their boat, the Egerson, the boat that sits right outside BHA. That is the Egerson, tied up at the lighthouse. You can see that nice flat rock that was there that in a calm day you could put a big boat in there. The warm summer night began cool and my family boarded the Egerson. This lighthouse memory ended in a blanket of stars overhead and simmering water below as Dad piloted the tug toward home in East Bay. It's the most lasting image I have of the reporter John B. Chappell on Sand Island. This is John Chappell to the far left in the lighthouse photo. And you can tell it's the same day because you got that woman in the stripes is also on the old lighthouse tower, which isn't there any longer. The 4th of July was celebrated on Sand Island, going way back to the earliest of days. This particular photo is from at the schoolhouse on Sand Island back in, I believe the school was built in 1910, so it would have been after 1910. But these are all of the East Bay people. There may even have been some Shaw Point people there, but celebrating the 4th of July. I believe that is Bert Noring in the blue shirt. This was taken from a still from a Bill Hewling movie. Over on the right is Paul Trivovich and Mrs. Bykowski, Larry's mother. They lived in the Chicago house at Sand Bay. I'm not sure if they were up there during 4th of July celebrations, but I put this in there to show the inside of Herman Johnson Jr.'s bar. That's the front door there where the gas pumps were, for those who are familiar, before they tore it down. We used to wait to go over to Little Sand Bay for the 4th of July. In this picture, this was not taken for the 4th of July. This was just a picture that my Aunt Adele took. In the back is my sister Connie, cousin Harold, Carl, me with the bandolier on, David in the middle, Sharon, and then Philip. Of interest in this picture is that boat that is on the beach. We always called it the John Shaw boat. I'm not sure if it was or not. Sand Bay looked different back in those days. This is Herman's dock at Sand Bay back in the 50s. And you can see on the back side of that dock, you can see the J on the smokestack of the boat, the Sand Bay. No L, no nothing there. So it was a north wind. I don't know what they did because the north wind would blow right in there. but this is what it looked like when I was a kid. These are actual photos from a 4th of July celebration. I believe this is 1952 at Sand Bay. These may have come from Wayne Peterson, who is a town of Russell person, and he had sent me some pictures, but I just found it interesting that there was like quite a gathering at Sand Bay. It was a beautiful time, a beautiful place. This bigger picture here is the Lady Grace, which was my grandfather Fred Hansen's boat. I like it for a couple of reasons. One is you can see the old-fashioned lifter there up in front of the flag. That flag says LG on it for Lady Grace. The little girl in the middle of those 5 kids is my mother. But around the same time of the story is this picture, which is my brother Carl, Paul Hansen, me, Ruth Ann Compton, her dad, Ray, my dad, my mother, and other relatives. We met out at Sand Bay on the 4th of July many, many times. This I put in there because it's July 4th, 1976, our 200th anniversary. We have Sharon there in an old-fashioned swimsuit, and so we were still celebrating on the beach, on Sand Island, up to 1976 and beyond. I have in the story that I looked in my grandfather's diary that he kept for 25 years, and not one time did he mention the 17th of May, Sietta Maya, which is Norway's Independence Day, but literally every year for 25 years he mentioned going somewhere or doing something, going to a dance at the West Bay Club or at Sand Bay or going for a picnic or whatever on July 4th every year. When you live on an island, storms are critical to you, and how you handle them decides whether you are an islander or not. People who are visiting the island get out there in a storm and they say, oh gosh, it's raining, it's wet. But actually a storm can be extremely beautiful. I have 3 pictures from a movie that I took in the 60s. I had a Super 8 camera. This has just caught that wave at just the right time. This is our dock. Storms were fun, but critical when you know how to handle them. I'm not going to read the stuff. It pretty much tells you that a northeast wind comes from 200 miles down the lake. The East Bay is relatively shallow, so you're not going to get high waves, but you're going to get sharp waves. I close out that story by talking about my brother Carl and I going sailing in a storm, and that's a little boat that we went sailing in that we sailed down toward Big Sand Bay and tied up on Herman Johnson's and drank some beers, and my dad came out to rescue us, and of course we were having fun, so we didn't need rescuing. I say in the story, I think his only regret was that he wasn't with us. This is inside Gert Wellish's house. You see the U.S. Lighthouse Service, because she rented the lighthouse for quite a few years. Gert was dead at this time. She had died earlier. But that's Mariel Corfage, my mother, my Uncle Mel. I believe that's Stephen, my Aunt Adele, sister Connie, and Paul and Robert Durham. But every year, Mariel and Gert, when Gert lived there, she would have us up for a meal or entertainment or whatever. This is the road. This is a modern picture of it. This was probably taken 5 years ago. You can see how it was really a well-maintained path. It went from East Bay clear to what we call the point. We didn't call it Hills Point or Shaw Point or Hewlings Point or what. We just called it the point. But this is the trail as it went through there. The houses on the actual East Bay Road, the first house you would have come across coming from the north would have been our place. This is on the right. Next to it, the White House is my Uncle Mel's place. He had 5 boys, Harold, David, Philip, Stephen, Norman. The porch on his house was built from lumber that he repurposed from the old schoolhouse. The one on the left here is Palms, which was on the East Bay Road. On the right is Plenty Charm, which is one of the places that the AIHCP is hoping to work to restore to this pristine condition. This picture was probably taken fairly soon after it was built because it was in beautiful shape. Here's the old schoolhouse on Sand Island. It was standing when I was a kid. There were some desks in there and some books and that kind of a thing. The outhouse there on the left, I believe, is the girls' house only because it has the protective shield in front of it, where the boys' outhouse was on the right-hand side, and I don't believe it had that protective shield on it. And I threw this in just because I found it interesting. This was a Christmas card that Gert Wellish did back in the 60s. This is a photo from inside her place looking out to the lake. A beautiful photograph. I'm going to read this little section simply because it means so much to me. In this picture is Fred Anderson, Kitty Anderson, 3 of their guests, and me. My first workday at Shaw Point gave me an inkling that point meals differed from ours. Come 12 o'clock, the Andersons invited me to sit down for lunch with them and their guests, and they invited me every workday after that. It was not long before I realized the Andersons had full-blown fancy noon meals. Over the years, they served varied recipes of fresh-caught grilled fish, or standing rib roast, or marinated chicken, always with a salad, vegetable, and a dessert. They welcomed me into their family. I think they appreciated to have a young person around with younger ideas. They were very inquisitive people. The road was rebuilt. This is not in my book either, but this is the Caterpillar. I believe they brought it over from the West Bay Club. They widened the road. I mean, it was 2 car widths wide, and it stood like that for a couple of years. Right now, you wouldn't recognize any road whatsoever other than in the East Bay portion. This old house here is the old Will Palm house. And in the book, I write about if I had to walk back to East Bay after dark, when I would get to this point, and you would know, even if you couldn't see the house, you'd know because there were ferns there. But that was a scary place. And you can imagine what it would have been like. It was haunted as far as I was concerned. We leave the island for a couple of stories. This is one, in fact, I originally called it Frozen Tundra. This is 1954. Carl, my brother Carl, Dickie Compton, who lives in Bayfield. Dickie and Carl ran together. They were in the same grade in school, and they declared to me that we were going to go out camping one weekend in January. As I recall, we never sought nor granted permission by our parents. We merely dreamed up the idea and then planned to go. Well, these winter pictures that you see here are not from Bayfield. These are from Sand Island. This is over at what we called Anderson's, which is Kimmer's. That's my dad over by the lighthouse. This is from the winter that Carl spent on Sand Island back in the 70s. And that's our house in the winter time. It's hard to find winter photos. These 3 I had, so I put them in here just to show what winter looks like. As it turned out, it got to be 20 below zero that night, and we nearly froze when we got back into my mother's place. And my mother and my sister Sharon were there, and she said, we didn't know where you went. We didn't know when you were coming back. You know, the radio said it was 20 below last night. You're lucky you didn't kill yourself. And that was it. There's no more discussion of it. That was quite a cold weather camping experience, and that is written up in the book. Transition, that's me and roughly a freshman in high school. But I wrote this for Tom Williamson before he died. He wanted to know what it was like growing up in Bayfield during that period of time. This is before Tom was there. So I wrote this story for him. That's what it was like going from the 8th grade through the 9th grade in Bayfield High School. Those of you who are from small towns, you understand that in small towns you have the same opportunities that the kids have in the big cities. However, you have more opportunities in that there are less people to do the work. We did a lot of the same things, had the proms, had the basketball games, went skiing, ice skating. Here in this last paragraph, there was plenty of action for those willing to take a chance and take part. City schools may have had more activities or bigger gyms or ballrooms, but we small towners did much the same things, just on a smaller scale. Similar efforts went into a Bayfield prom as into Chicago, Milwaukee, or Minneapolis sororities. In one sense, we had an added advantage that there weren't many of us, so a wide variety of people, some with lesser skills, got to participate, and that's very true of a small town. This is a true story. At least it's true from the time this man and his son met us on the beach. They had come out from central Wisconsin, and they came up to Little Sand Bay. They were in a boat. There was nothing wrong with the boat. It was made for inland water. They landed their boat at Lighthouse Bay, which is on the north side of the island, with no protection from any wind whatsoever. The slightest of winds would cause trouble. The boat got swamped. And so they went and got into the lighthouse and spent the night in the lighthouse. I think Jeff took this picture of that arch, which is now gone on Swallow Point. the man and his son admired the caves on Swallow Point. This is a small picture blown up of the second story bedroom at the lighthouse. They walked over into East Bay, and fortunately, my brother Carl and I were there. We were the only ones who were in East Bay at that time. We got our boat and went over to Lighthouse Bay, was able to get their boat off the beach, bailed out, and we towed them to Sand Bay. The whole point of that is that don't go out into Lake Superior unless you're prepared, and primarily 2 engines. They had a single engine boat. This is what we called Aphrodite, the little statue. In this photo is Harold Rothschild, a partner of Fred Anderson, me, Wanda Harris, who is Phoebe Harris's mother, and Art Harris, and Phoebe Inch, who these 2 are sisters. I tell the story of how I discovered it while mowing one day, and we fixed it up, and this is what it looked like after they painted it. I didn't necessarily agree with painting it, but then when they did, it was fairly striking. Carol Anderson took over the Fred Anderson property after he passed, and she took the statue somewhere to be fixed. She subsequently died very young, and nobody knows where the statue is today. Just that this metal pond still exists out there right in front of the Savona. Recipes, we had a lot of recipes, 19, I believe I said. This is at the Yinch Cottage. Every year they had a party that they invited old Sand Islanders to, and we were fortunately, Carl, Sharon, and I. Carl has been to the most, Carl and Sharon the next most, and I to the least. Peter Yinch always made sure that we were invited. It was always a joyful time to be in the Yinch Cottage on Sand Island. I didn't put the recipes in, obviously, because there are 19 of them, but I did put in part of my mother's winter shopping list that people found fascinating. And I only put in the first page. Like I say on the bottom, you have to buy the book to see the rest of it. This is the book. You can go to www.theislander.store and buy one. The Echo is the publisher of it, Jeff Peters. We'd appreciate it if you would buy some. I had one other page I put in here, and this is another book that we are working on. It's The Islander, the East Bay Sagas. These are just strictly East Bay stories, and then it ends up with our melding with the people at the point in later years. This picture was taken by Beth Madsen, whom I have, I think, it's either 93 or 98 of her pictures. And this one to the left here was taken by Irv Tanning. That's Sharon, my mother, me, Carl, Connie, Joanne Palm Tanning, Bessie, and I think that might be Brian. I'm not sure though.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. History is the stories that we preserve and share over time, and it's such a treat to hear your firsthand stories about your family and your experiences growing up on Sand Island. I particularly like that winter shopping list at the end because I think it highlights the amount of planning and grit and resilience that it takes to survive year-round on an island. And perhaps those kind of characters are what we're all cultivating these days as we all adapt to COVID. I see Linda Shear is asking, when did the Sand Island School close and why?
Closed in 1928. There just weren't enough kids out there to have a school. I think when they had it, you can see some of those pictures of the school, and they had 20, 30 kids out there, and many of them Norings, but there were Moes, Hansons. My mother went to school there. My dad went to school there, but they grew up and they didn't need the school anymore.
Molly Rice is asking, where is the davit?
That's an old tale from years ago. I was out there with my brother Carl, and my 2 sons were out there, and we took off in the middle of the night in a storm, and it did not end well. The davit is from the Savona, by the way.
Linda Shear, she's asking you to tell everyone about the fires near a stream to make smoke, to tell people to come and get their kids.
The spot for us was over by what is Buren's, Linda, which would be where your grandparents' place was in Mose. When you would light a fire there, Herman Johnson Jr. would see it and he would come up. And at the point around the corner, not in the field, but on the beach, if they lit a fire there, that somebody would know to come over and see what was wrong.
I remember my dad telling me something about if it was burning on one side of this stream, it was so-and-so's family. And if the Norings couldn't come, someone else. I mean, the island worked together so much. I've heard a few anecdotes from my dad about sharing oxen until they could buy their own horses. And
when you live on an island, you either get along or you get off. You can't afford to hold grudges and that kind of a thing. You just had to get along, and you helped each other out. And some people had some skills, or like you say, your grandfather had oxen, which they used for hauling logs or plowing or whatever. And I know the Hansons had cows and chickens, and they would share. In the story about the Savona, I write about at the end them having kind of a canning bee at the end of that story. That's what they did, especially in East Bay. Now, the point people were more connected to the mainland than the East Bay people were. They were pretty self-sufficient in East Bay.
Perhaps we can even convince Bob to come back to talk either more stories from this book or his upcoming book. And if you enjoyed this program, the Bayfield Heritage Association certainly appreciates your support. You can donate securely through our website, bayfieldheritage.org. Thank you all, and stay tuned for more from us coming up.